Jane Eyre, Part 2. Lecture by Dr. Sally L. Sheikh. Jane Eyre is structured as follows. 3 stages of Jane's life depicting the growth and maturity of her personal and professional life, and of her character as a Bildungsroman character, and as Byronic heroine, which is not common as a stereotype in the Victorian novel. The 3 stages of Jane's journey in life are located in 5 locations: childhood in Gateshead, childhood and teenage and early adulthood in Lowood, adulthood in Thornfield, the biggest share, Marsh End and Ferndean. Readers are told the story from Jane's perspective, first perspective narrator, and they are being engaged into the text and participating as not only audience, but also friends of Jane herself, the narrator, and accordingly of Charlotte Bronte, as she addresses readers directly telling them her inner feelings and thoughts, and she states that every chapter is a new scene acted before them. A new chapter in a novel is something like a new scene in a play, and when I draw up the curtain this time, reader, you must fancy you see a room in the George Inn at Millcote, with such large figured papering on the walls as in rooms have, such a carpet, such furniture, such ornaments on the mantelpiece, such prints, including a portrait of George III, and another of the Prince of Wales, and a representation of the death of Wolfe. Bronte, 138. The first 11 chapters tell the story of Jane's childhood, as we discussed before. Then in chapter 12, Jane starts her journey in Thornfield, and meets the love of her life, Mr. Edward Rochester. Outside Thornfield, while walking, Jane had a vision of a legendary creature from Greek myths called Gytrash, that is crossing her way, another supernatural and Gothic element, followed by a man riding a horse. The first meeting between Jane and Rochester reflects her dominance over him, although he is a tough man, but the moment she crossed his path he lost control and fall from his horse. Jane has a great power over Rochester, who believes that she is an elf who has magical powers, and lives with little green men. Under her spell he was ready to go against society, and marry her. In Thornfield, Jane discovered her new identity as a strong woman, who refuses to be dependent, and along with this discovery emerged the love game, because people like to play games even in love. We watch the lovers changing, each one taking a different role in the relationship, and practicing mind games like arising jealousy, for example, by pretending to care for another woman. It is amusing to watch lovers teasing each other and testing their limits. In Thornfield, the reader is introduced to a mysterious character, who is hidden in the 3rd floor, and the only thing that appears is her mysterious laugh that makes Jane feel uncomfortable. The laugh is a Gothic element, as it might be a ghost in the house. Later, we are introduced to the story of Adele, Rochester's ward. From the conversation between Jane and Rochester about his French mistress, Adele's mother, we learn why Rochester fall for Jane, as she represents the opposite of his previous mistress who betrayed him. Rochester refers to her as a seductress who only seeks the gold in his pockets, and would be with any other man for the same reason. Celine Varens represents vanity and serves as the double or opposite of Jane, who, unlike Celine and Miss Blanche, refused to submit the rules of a male-dominated society, and to be considered not equal to men, not worthy of being educated, or being independent. She rebelled and fought for her rights as a human being equal to men. While Jane was sleeping dreaming of Rochester, someone tried to burn him in his room, an incident which refers to something serious happening in this place, but resulted in sparkling the love more between Jane and Rochester. This incident of burning Rochester alive while sleeping is the introduction to the mysterious character, who everyone denies her existence in Thornfield, an incident that introduces the readers to this woman who wants to be noticed, who needs help, and who for sure hates Rochester to the extent of killing him. Meet the captive woman who was secretly kept in Thornfield for years in the attic, Bertha Antoinetta Mason. Bertha is a Creole, referred to as a colored woman, not white, from Spanish Town, Jamaica, conquered by the British Empire, a short history brought by Bronte to discuss colonialism, but in brief referring to slaves then to British colonies in West Indies. In 1966, Jean Rhys published a novel, Wide Sargasso Sea, that is believed to be a prequel to Bronte's Jane Eyre. Rhys' novel tells the story of Bertha Antoinetta Mason from her youth in the Caribbean to her unhappy marriage and her relocation to England. It tells the story of the mad woman in the attic from a different point of view. Every story has a dark side, and the story of Bertha Antoinetta Mason is the dark side of Jane's story that Bronte didn't hide, but rather ghosted. In Jane Eyre, Bertha serves as Jane's double, juxtaposing the feminist to a woman constrained by domesticity. She is a Creole woman from Jamaica, daughter of a merchant in West Indies who was married to Rochester, an arranged marriage for the estate she inherited. Bertha is introduced as a severe case of madness less than an animal's behavior, and a killing machine, who targets Mr. Rochester. In Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester is a victim of such a marriage, and he could not control Bertha, so he locked her in the attic, and traveled everywhere to have affairs with other women. She represents the only barrier between Rochester and Jane, and after her death the lovers happily married. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Bertha, or rather Antoinetta Causeway, experienced colonialism, and witnessed the destruction of her family, and was forced into marriage to a foreigner, who doesn't want her, and who doesn't even speak her language. Bertha isn't her real name, it was given to her by Rochester. Wide Sargasso Sea opens with Antoinetta as a child telling the story of her family's plantation in Jamaica, which was abandoned and neglected after the Slavery Abolition Act that abolished slavery in the British Empire in 1834, and the destruction that affected her family. Antoinetta's mother Annette remarried an English man, Mr. Mason, who wanted to get her fortune and make use of her situation. Their house was burned down by angry liberated slaves rebelling against planter class, who restored prosperity. Annette and her daughter Antoinetta had to experience another trauma of loss. Antoinetta's mentally disabled brother died in the fire. Annette could not survive this trauma, and she was on the edge of sanity, but Mr. Mason sent her to live with a couple who tormented her till she died, and Antoinetta was raised away from her. Imagine a child like Antoinetta in such circumstances lived such traumatic experiences, how fragile this child would be. The second part of the novel is about Antoinetta's marriage, and how she lived miserable with a foreign husband who doesn't love her, doesn't speak her language, and who always cheats on her. With Rochester she lived emotional and physical abuse for 15 years or more. Antoinetta tried to give Rochester a love potion, to make him love her, but the potion acted like poison. Convinced that she was trying to kill him, Rochester took Antoinetta to England and confined her to the attic in Thornfield Hall. Rochester kept his relationships with other women and never cared for Antoinetta, who's mentally tortured after everything he had been doing, and she is willing to get salvation. After the arrival of the governess, Jane, who is to be a bride for Mr. Bronte's treatment of Bertha's story is shallow, reflecting the shallow nature of Jane and her negative situation. Instead of helping Bertha, she ran away and only came back after her death. Who is the real victim in the story even without reading Wide Sargasso Sea? Is it Rochester or Bertha? Rochester claimed that he tried to help Bertha and to cure her mental illness, but could not, and the only solution was to keep her prisoner in the attic for 15 years. Bertha was described as aggressive, eating fabrics and biting Rochester, and speaking like animals, only moaning and growling, and not speaking English. Bertha lived a miserable life as a child, and was a prisoner for the rest of her life. She lived many traumatic experiences in her homeland, and in the land of the conqueror. Uprooted from her land, away from her people, and locked in an attic in the land of the conqueror, married only by name to someone who is different from her, and who cheats and tortures her, Bertha developed hysterical visions and surrendered to it. Rochester never tried sincerely to help Bertha. He could let her go to her homeland, or divorced her, but he chose to neglect her and ghost her existence. Instead of offering medical care for her, she was left to die in the attic mercilessly. Bertha is the silent heroine who announced her existence and rebellion with deeds or actions, because actions speak louder than words. Bertha was treated as a ghost from the beginning until the end, depicted as a mere ghost figure with scary lunatic ghostly laugh, and not as a human being. Even after her place and her condition were revealed to everyone including Jane, she was treated still as a monster, and after her death she was ghosted again as if she never existed. Bronte chose to ghost Bertha for one purpose, that is to glorify the love relationship between Jane and Rochester, and to shed the light on the Bildungsroman heroine and the Byronic hero, and their journey of learning and growth. Rhys' work, unlike Bronte's, provides a fair treatment of the story. Bertha's medical condition is called Huntington disease. Huntington's theory or diagnosis was not confirmed or published as a medical essay until 1871, and it came after the publication of Bronte's novel in 1848, but once it was published it increased the awareness of neuropsychiatrists of the symptoms, diagnosis and treatment of the case of Bertha. As a Gothic story, can we say that Bertha took her revenge and took Rochester's sight? What do you think? The technique of doubles and characters is represented through two sets of cousins of 3 children each. The first set are the Reeds that tortured and humiliated Jane as a child, and the second set are the Rivers who welcomed the adult Jane before even knowing her name, and took care of her, and with them she experienced the meaning of family and love. These two sets are used by Bronte to illustrate the difference, and to explain that not all people are like the Reeds because the universe is like a yin-yang, a balanced white and black integrated in one circle, but in order to discover that Jane has to experience both sides to know the difference, and to find an answer to her questions while a child why life is cruel to her, and why it's not fair for her. It also serves as a juxtaposition of the working class like the Rivers, and the upper class who don't work, and depend on the fortunes they inherited till it is all spent like the Reeds. Jane decided to share the inheritance of her uncle with them, because of the love and support they gave her, and the chance to live with a family of her own. Teachers play a very important role in building Jane's character and career. Bronte again used the doubles to illustrate the difference between how a teacher should be to be a role model, and how the teacher should never be as represented by Miss Temple and Miss Scatcherd. As Helen represented the double of Jane in childhood, as we discussed before, two faces of the same coin, Celine Varens and Miss Blanche and Bertha Mason serve as the double of the adult Jane Eyre. Feminism in Jane Eyre. As a male child, John Reed always practiced verbal and physical violence against Jane because he wanted to control her. He ordered her to call him master, and he always ordered her to obey. Jane refused to be treated as a servant or as inferior, and she rebelled against him, and even had beaten him to stop him from beating her. Jane rejected the religious beliefs that punish only women as applied in Lowood by Mr. Brocklehurst. She refused to believe that God punishes only women. As an adult she refused to be controlled by any man, even Mr. Rochester, who she loved. When he offered her to run away with him she left him. She refused to be controlled by St. John Rivers, who tried to control her by marrying her for his profession to be helpful in his missionary job in India. Both John Reed and John Rivers tried to control Jane emotionally and physically.